Good evening, and thank you all for being here. I know it's late in the day, it's late in the program, and Ronan Farrow is out there somewhere doing something or other. So I'm glad you're all here for this session. Let me introduce myself first. I'm Corey Powell. I'm the co-founder of OpenMind magazine, which is a new magazine sort of dedicated to issues around science, misinformation, and disinformation. You can find us online at openmindmag.org. And we are currently working on a project with the Pulitzer Center and HHMI under their Truth Decay project, which was part of the inspiration for this panel. So that is the inspiration that brought together this wonderful group here. The advantage of coming late in the conference is you get to hear all that's come before. A lot of very very smart but often to me kind of like big picture discussions about problems of misinformation. And I'm excited to have three people here who are very, I would say sort of boots on the ground people who have they have a lot of embodied experience at dealing with with issues of misinformation and disinformation from a position of a medical practitioner who's crossed over, who's done books and outreach, a neuroscience researcher on social media, and a reporter who's engaged in a lot of different things. So I hate to do resume announcements, but I feel like with this group, it's kind of helpful to know a little bit of who you have. So first of all, to my left, we have Seema Yasmin. Now you wear a lot of different hats. You are the director of the Stanford Health Communication Initiative. You're a clinical assistant professor at Stanford University's Department of Medicine. You're a visiting professor at the Anderson School of Management at UCLA, University of California. You've worked extensively as a journalist. You've written 5 books, and 2 of them the 2 most recent ones are particularly interesting to me. One called Viral BS, which is very relevant, and your most recent one, What the Fact? Finding truth in all the noise, which is aimed to a younger audience and kind of bringing these ideas about science misinformation to them. Can you just tell us a little bit about this very interesting journey from medicine to popular writing, and especially to confronting these issues of science misinformation?
Yeah, sure. And hi, everyone. How are you doing? Good. I want to start off, though, by saying thank you to the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, represented by Richard Stone here, and the Pulitzer Center with Steve Sapienza. And just a quick plug, they don't pay me to say this, but I've been working with the Pulitzer Center since 2015, and all of the journalists in this room, you should be looking at their website because they support reporters in telling underreported stories. And I think we all know those areas in our beats that don't get enough coverage, and Pulitzer Center has been so supportive to me over the years in doing that kind of reporting that's really important to me. So thank you to them for bringing us all together. And yeah, my journey's a really unusual one, and I landed in journalism because I wanted to get rich, basically. That's why we all do it, right? No, my mother was like, wait, you went from medicine and public health and then journalism? She's like, are you trying to earn less and less money? But I did start off as a doctor, then I became a disease detective working for the US government as an officer in the Epidemic Intelligence Service doing outbreak investigations. So if you've watched Contagion, I did the job that Kate Winslet does in that movie without dying.
That makes you better than Kate Winslet.
I consider that a success. I do love Kate Winslet. And really the way that I landed in journalism, besides from my need to get really rich, was out of absolute necessity. Because as a physician, I had so many of those moments where a patient says to you, but here's a page I have folded in my pocket from the Daily Mail that says you have a cure for cancer. And it happens all the time. We know that misinformation and disinformation is rife. I had patients who would refuse antibiotic treatment. I had patients, of course, that would refuse vaccinations. And I felt like those conversations about science and health we were just having amongst ourselves. And we weren't doing a good job of communicating facts to a bigger audience. When I then went to work as a disease detective with the federal government, it was the same thing, just on a larger scale. So every epidemic I got sent to investigate, it was never just a virus that was spreading. It was a virus and a ton of misinformation and disinformation about the virus, about the vaccine, about me as a doctor, about the CDC, which I was representing, or the federal government, because I had my big shiny metal badge and I was saying, I'm with the government and I'm here to help. And it just felt to me so futile that we had this singular focus on trying to stamp out a contagion of a pathogen, but we weren't dealing with the contagion of information at all. So it was honestly born out of moments of wanting to pull my hair out that I kind of sidestepped and went back to school, something I said I would never do after medical school because I'm not a masochist. But I did then go to journalism school because I thought, if I'm going to be effective as a public health doctor, I need to understand storytelling. And I need to understand why it is that anti-vaccine messaging is so compelling and goes so viral. And meanwhile, the truth about vaccines kind of sits lonely and dying in the corner. And then as I merge, just to wrap this up and bring it back to the book that you mentioned, Corey, I'm now in this space where for over a decade I've been studying the spread of disease, but the spread of disinformation about disease, understanding why it is that people might hold on to and believe the lies versus the scientific facts. And what it led to was me thinking, I'm not giving up on adults. I think we can be saved too, and we can be taught critical thinking, but we do have to start with kids. We have to teach these ideas to kids. So when Corey yesterday was like, why did you write What the Fact for teenagers? My answer was basically the January 6th insurrection, and this idea that this will happen again and again and again if we're not teaching these core skills of media literacy, digital literacy, and critical thinking at a young age. So even though adults read What the Fact because it's fun and it's accessible, it is aimed at smart teenagers who get this stuff. And just to wrap up, I'll say, this can feel really doom and gloom, right? Fake news, this intractable problem of lies going viral and the truth just sitting in the corner. And my friends will say to me, like, you must be so depressed and pessimistic all the time because you study fake news and you study why we fall for this stuff. And it's quite the opposite. Because I sit in the space and I do a lot of solutions journalism, I am so optimistic and energized about fighting these problems. And because I get to now hang out with teenagers, and especially middle grade students are my favorite, I feel so optimistic that if we teach them what is in What the Fact, if we teach them evidence-based methods for becoming really savvy, becoming really good critical thinkers, knowing how to spot misinformation a mile away, knowing the red flags, knowing how to teach their friends, then actually we can get ourselves out of this mess.
I have two teenage daughters at home, and so I can confirm that it is possible for teenagers not only to be very savvy, but to be very savvy even when their father is a science journalist and they don't want to be imitating him, and yet somehow they end up savvy anyway. So that's, to me that's encouraging. It also, as you were talking, it struck me that the kind of optimism that you're describing about viral BS is the same as the optimism for as a doctor or as an epidemiologist, that spending all of your time dealing with disease is not depressing because you have. I mean, it certainly has its. I understand, but you have to be motivated by a sense that that it's possible to make things better.
Absolutely.
So next, I'd like to change directions significantly and go to Kat, who has a very different kind of background. You have a wide-ranging set of experiences. You're as a writer for Popular Science and for Fortune magazine, an affordability reporter for TVO, as a freelancer who's covered COVID pandemic for the New York Times, sometimes called the newspaper of record, but whatever, other publications, and especially interesting to me as a misinformation trainer for Journalists for Human Rights. And misinformation depends a lot on context. It's not just one thing in one place. Can you talk about, since you've had these very different experiences talking to very different types of audiences and different formats of stories, Can you talk a little bit about the different types of misinformation that you've encountered and maybe how you were able to react to it?
Sure. Hello. Yeah, there. Sure, I'd be happy to. So I got involved with Journalists for Human Rights as a misinformation trainer. I essentially taught other reporters how to report on misinformation. Frankly, because I was a freelancer at the time, and they got in touch and were like, we need someone to do this, to add to this group of people we have, and we have a pot of money we would like to give you. And I was like, I like pots of money. But I also, misinformation and disinformation. So the difference between those two terms, misinformation is kind of the catch-all term. Disinformation specifically is information that is spread with intent to harm and misinform. I mean, for one thing, it's not new. It's really, really old. It's as old as people. We talk, we gossip, rumors, hoaxes. Like, this is all not new stuff. But it's also, there is a way in which it's just really interesting to me that these subjects that are so important, so foundational, like medicine, like health, these things that like get us where we live, are the things that people are really vulnerable to misinformation about because it's emotional. You're afraid, you're worried, you're concerned. We all experienced this with COVID. You remember when you didn't know what virus was and you were worried and everyone was just freaking out? Remember when people were like washing their grocery bags? During my reporting on COVID-19, I had just finished learning how to do misinformation reporting, and then I started being a science reporter during a pandemic, and so I immediately was doing misinformation reporting, because there was also the infodemic. And, we encountered everything from, very prominent people on Twitter, or people on Twitter who like to be really loud, using really panicked language and either stretching the truth or stretching their expertise or tapping into these sort of larger networks of people who were deliberately spreading lies and rumors and hoaxes to just make themselves more popular, you know what I mean? To grow their social media footprint and to make themselves feel good. It feels good to have people's attention. We encountered everything from that to, leafleting campaigns, people actually spreading things through like stickers on walls, that kind of thing. And then we also just encountered the way that social media promotes conversation. You know what I mean? Facebook is a great example of this. Someone can be genuinely very concerned about, an issue, and they might encounter a piece of false information that's been created by someone who is looking to spread false information, profit from it, and do harm. And they can fall for it, and they can reshare it just because they are concerned and they want people to know. So you're looking at a spectrum of actors with a spectrum of intents. You're looking at every platform, every medium through which we communicate with one another, from like word of mouth to, Twitter. And then you're also looking at narratives that are much older than the current iteration of them. So the misinformation and disinformation I encountered covering COVID-19 when I was very new to this beat has a really long history. I collect books about the HIV/AIDS pandemic and the history of it, and I have this book that I'm not going to tell you the name of because it's horrible, but it's a book about how HIV/AIDS does not exist. It's not real. It's from the early 90s. And I bought it because I was reading it, and I was in this gay bookstore, and I was so shocked by how exactly the same language and exactly the same narratives were being used from othering people and sort of pointing to different groups of people as spreaders or problems to, concerns about vaccines, concerns about all these other things, exactly the same language being used. So none of this is new. But what is new, and I'll close with this, what is new is the reach it has, and the reach that regular people can have on a normal day, and how much faster information travels now. So it's an old problem, it's a new problem, there's a lot of forms to it. And I think that's why I actually think that's why it's so hard to report on, but that's kind of a bigger question. Thanks.
So before we continue to Ben, I'm wondering, because you've written for quite different types of publications, like when you're writing for, say, a magazine like Popular Science or Fortune, versus when you're doing more local journalism or when you're writing for the New York Times, obviously, you're limited in the feedback that you see. You see what pops up in social media, or for places that have comments, or what you see in comments. But were you able to get a sense of, are there any systematic differences in the types of responses that you saw in these different audiences, or is it more of a sort of a general reaction that just kind of like it draws, a skeptics or a knee-jerk kind of population?
Well, I mean, as a freelancer, which I was for almost all of the COVID-19 pandemic, you don't have access to the metrics, the internal metrics. You very rarely hear feedback from your editors about how a story did. You might hear, oh, that did well for us or something like that, but that's it. So I have a very limited sense of the actual concrete impact of my work through any of the very imperfect ways we have of measuring that. But I did notice, I did one specific story on, that was a primer on how to spot and how to figure out what is misinformation when you meet it in the wild for the Times. And I did notice that got shared on Facebook in a way, because the language was very basic. I wrote it, I try to write everything to be simple, but I wrote it to be really simple. I just want people to be able to read it on their phone briefly. I wanted anybody to be able to read it and understand when they're scrolling what they might be encountering. I did notice that one spread a lot more on Facebook. I encountered it more there. I anecdotally heard about it more there. And other stories that I've done on misinformation, disinformation have ended up behind the paywall. So I don't, it really depends on the audience of the outlet. The other thing I'll say is just that there is kind of a really tedious feeling of preaching to the choir when you write about these issues, because someone who doesn't, someone who's not on the thin line of falling off into disinformation and misinformation, someone who is committed to believing that is not going to read your piece, or they're going to read it and they're going to be like, I'm sorry, I'm going to curse, but this is some of the feedback I got on the internet. She's just a dumb bitch. She just doesn't know what she's talking about. Why would she know about this? And they're going to write it off, and they're going to use whatever they can to discredit that information. So there are ways in which I think that journalists need to learn how to be better about reaching people who are, still reading about both sides of the thing, both sides of the idea of whether or not, COVID is real or whatever. That's not even, that's a pretty robust one. And the other thing is that, it's not just journalists. It has to start, I think Seema is completely right. It has to start with kids. It has to start really young, and it has to be something that is also just about support for education, for access to resources, something that makes people less afraid and less unstable, because that fear and that instability is why people find misinformation and disinformation attractive.
Great, thank you, and that's also a great setup for Ben. I realize I cut off your last name, so Kat Eschner and then Ben Rein at the end here. Ben, you're another person who's sort of gone on a journey. You're a postdoc at Stanford. I'm fascinated that you study empathy, the sorts of empathy in mice, or I guess the source of empathy in the brain in mice, as part of your research. But you also have this other life as a TikToker with more than 700,000 followers, doing often fairly deep science-based TikToks to, I guess what would once be considered an untraditional audience, although it's less and less untraditional these days. And I've learned you've also been experimenting with AI as a creative tool in some of your writing and some of your art generation, which we can get to some of that later. But I'd love to hear just about that journey from being a researcher, from being a postdoc, into science communication and into the world of TikTok, which you've somehow managed to crack the problem of how you build a science TikTok following. So I'd love to hear about that.
Of course. Happy to be here, everyone. It's really exciting. I'm a neuroscientist, as Corey explained. I'm not a journalist, and I study the brain circuits that regulate social interaction and things like empathy. But a couple years back at the beginning of the pandemic, I went to the grocery store for the first time. We all had that period where we were locked down, and then we entered society again. And for me, I went out, and everybody was trying their best to wear surgical masks because they were instructed to, but nobody really was thoroughly instructed on how to wear these. And so, just kind of an observation. I'm walking around, people had their masks inside out, upside down, they didn't have the bar clasped, and I was used to wearing these in the lab. And so I got home and I thought, I could really, my friends and family could probably benefit from some sort of instructional video on how to put one of these on. And I wanted to film myself, and the only app that I had on my phone that would film a 60-second piece straight through without cutting me off at every 10 or 15 seconds was TikTok. So I filmed it. I had never posted on TikTok, had hardly used it, had just downloaded it, kind of curious to explore it. And the only way to save a video on TikTok is to post it. So I uploaded it, took the downloaded video, went to Facebook, shared it. Hey, friends and family, here's how you wear this. And then a couple days later, I opened my TikTok back up, and the video had like hundreds of thousands of views. As sometimes happens to people, I think that's how many people get started on TikTok, by just chance. And the video ended up getting 1.6 million views in total. And I really felt the impact of that I was able to reach this very broad audience with something really important that they actually could benefit from at a time of need, where they were, like you mentioned, very probably afraid and uncertain. And I just started answering questions about the brain. I explained I'm a neuroscientist, I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm not a virologist, but I'll talk about the brain if you'd like. And so I started receiving questions from followers, and things grew. And over time, people would start tagging me in videos that were classic, what you would see right now and think that's classic TikTok misinformation. Someone at home with their phone talking about something that seems impossible, but it's so compelling because if it's true, it's incredible. And people kept tagging me and saying things like, what about this? Like, gotcha, like this is true, so everything you say is false. And so at first I was like, is this, people actually believe this stuff? Because I was coming from a very traditional academic background. I had not really engaged with social media that much, especially in the realm of science. And so when I began to engage with that space, I realized how bad it actually was. And I began to do these debunking videos where users would tag me, and I would do what you can do on TikTok as a stitch, where you show first 5 seconds of a clip. And then I would just kind of interrupt them and explain gently, respectfully, why what they were saying was not true. And I would be as thorough as I could explaining it. And these things started off with the broad, obvious brain myths, like you use 10% of your brain, or you can be left or right-brained, which are both not true. Bummer, I'm sorry. But also, I did my PhD research in autism spectrum disorder, and of course there's the whole MMR vaccine and autism link that people talk about, also not true. And even getting more and more specific to the point where people were doing things like, I saw a video of someone had their baby sitting on a rock in the sun, and they were saying that because their baby was vegan, they didn't need to use sunscreen. And this person had over 1 million followers, and something like that is just so incredibly dangerous if their followers trust what they say. And so I realized, nobody was really doing this, and so I started debunking videos, and it's just, I've been lucky to kind of grow it into this platform, and now I'm working with the Pulitzer Center and Corey at OpenMind on this Truth Decay project, and it's been a very interesting and eye-opening experience to go from my deeply embedded within the lab, not at all interacting with society, to now I have 1 foot in research and 1 foot in social media, and the conversations I have with either foot are entirely different. And I think I've developed this appreciation that most scientists should be prepared for these conversations and should develop these skills so that when the opportunity comes, they can debunk something or can clearly and accessibly explain why something is not true.
Thanks, Ben. Now, Kat made a good point earlier that misinformation, disinformation issues, these are ancient issues. They're probably as old as as language, or maybe they predate language too. People were doing disinformation by grunt. Probably, it's deep in human nature. TikTok obviously has built a huge audience in a very short period of time, and people have talked a lot about TikTok as a vector for misinformation. You've tapped into the upside of it as a vector for not just debunking but for sort of active engagement. I know a lot of people would love to know more about how to crack that. Other than your lucky break that you had this first video that went viral, what kind of guidance can you give people to try to be a force for good there?
Yeah, what I've essentially learned over time is that you have to be engaging, and it's kind of funny because when I make a TikTok video, I almost have this alternate persona that's much more outgoing and much more excited about science than I would be if I were talking to a friend. But that's how you have to be. You have to get people excited, and I think the passion really shows through. And so when you see someone talking about a topic that they really, really care about, and a lot of the time it is genuine passion, it just makes a difference. And so I don't know. I think historically science has been very inaccessible, and the language used to discuss science has been very inaccessible. And you know, you have to be as concise as possible, but the challenge is often, as scientists, we're taught to embed as much nuance as possible into a presentation. You have to explain the methods, you have to explain the, you know, how a result could potentially be interpreted a different way, and all of that has to go away when you're on TikTok because you have 45 or 60 seconds. And so it's a bit of a puzzle, it's a bit of a challenge, but I actually really enjoy the challenge of trying to figure out how can I convey this complex topic in a way that I leave out all of the nuance, but the way I'm presenting it, I'm confident that they won't misunderstand it in a way that could be dangerous. And so learning, just kind of practicing that and figuring out like what is the perfect, appropriate analogy. You know, not a good enough analogy that could be misinterpreted, but the perfect analogy that leaves them with a true understanding of how this thing may be working is critical.
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, this issue of analogy is something that science journalists, or I mean, journalists in general, struggle with a lot. You know, so I worked many years as an editor at Discover Magazine and at Scientific American Magazine, and you know, I've seen a lot of different ways that you know, scientists and science journalists would, you know, sort of reach for, you know, some popular metaphors or some, you know, I mean, other than people were always looking for smoking guns and holy grails, but they were also looking for, you know, like certain things, you know, certain ways to explain concepts that sound good, but then when you actually parse them, they're misleading in a way that leaves an opening then for other people to say, oh, well, if you know, if you're thinking about it as, you know, as pouring water into a jug, why couldn't it be, you know, so, you know, I think there is that challenge of how to pick the right metaphors, and also just like the right emotional truths that things accept intuitively. Seema, you've been, as part of this most recent book project, you've been out there talking to students, to teenagers. What have those audience interactions been like? Are they savvy? Are they skeptical? Do they push back on you? What's that been like?
Oh, kids are brilliant. So it's been all of the above. It's been the hunger to have these conversations about quote unquote fake news. And I keep doing that because right at the beginning of What the Fact, I talk about how old misinformation and disinformation are, and I share words from different languages from hundreds of years ago, names like taradiddler and like all these weird names that existed to describe false information and the people that spread it. And so I share that with the kids. All of that to say it's not a new problem, and kids really get it. They want to talk about it. They realize that some of what they see is trying to dupe them or convince them. Unfortunately, but maybe not surprisingly, there's not a lot of opportunity for them to engage in discussion about that at school. And I should say viral BS is all about medical myths and health hoaxes, but What the Fact is everything. So it's by the end of the book, the person who's read it, adult or teenager, feels very empowered and optimistic that, okay, I already knew that false information spreading was a problem, but now I've read this book and I feel really empowered with the tools to spot the falsehoods, to have a good, productive argument with somebody who believes a lie, and to really get a handle on this problem. So the kids love it. They are savvy. They understand the nuance, which is great. They understand this stuff is complicated. And the teachers have loved it. The Pulitzer Center worked with me to create a teaching guide that goes with the book so that teachers can translate the chapters into exercises and classroom games. But there's also been the hand that goes up in, you know, among the young people, and it will be someone saying, I spread lies on TikTok. And so then there's always someone, and then the other classmates are like, yeah, he does. He's always spreading lies about, and it can be everything from like climate change to some rumor in the school. But then it's a really good entry point into like, well, why would somebody do that? Is it for entertainment? Is it because there's power in being able to shift people's minds? So it's been really fun. And I am convinced that we just are doing young people a disservice when we think they're not capable of engaging in these conversations. And the other thing that the book aims to do is to take them behind the scenes of journalism, to understand how we as journalists come across an idea, how we work with editors. It introduces them to ideas like agenda setting and framing and gatekeeping. Again, because I think a lot of what we do is like, oh, we're not fake news, you should trust the media, without really doing the legwork of, well, why should you trust us? And actually, sometimes we do make mistakes. Among the media also exists the Daily Mail, which we often call the Daily Fail in England, for many reasons. And how is it that we're going to build trust between us and younger readers unless we're taking them behind the scenes and introducing them to the ideas of how a story is made, why it is that a story might not be considered newsworthy and left on the floor in the editorial meeting. And again, the response to that has been fantastic. So my challenge to all of you, you're already doing amazing journalism, but I would get you to, if you're not already engaging younger audiences, think about that too, because they are willing to engage with us. We just have to meet them where they are.
Yeah, so Kat, what about us? What about the journalists who also need, who need training and who need to do better? I think we've all had the feeling of sometimes, even smart journalists, even colleagues of ours, sometimes you just want to shake them when you see how they respond or how they address these problems. But you worked on a training program. What was that like? And what techniques did you find most useful there?
Yeah, for sure. So I had mentioned this program was this curriculum was created by Journalists for Human Rights, a Canadian organization, and I'm just checking my notes. It was co-developed with Marcus Kolga, a researcher, Craig Silverman, who is formerly BuzzFeed, now ProPublica, and Civics, which is a Canadian democracy organization. And the most important thing that I learned when I was learning how to teach about this stuff was actually the ability to think about the conceptual sort of framework behind different kinds of fake information and false information that you see online, for instance. Not only the whole spectrum of intent to harm thing I was talking about earlier, but also digging into specific categories of how something can be sort of stretched or twisted, and just basically categorizing something that I didn't understand before I did the training, that people were already studying. Hossein Darakhshan, who wrote the paper Information Disorder, a very famous paper, is actually here. And I read that paper as part of this training. And I just really found the theoretical base. The reporting tips are great, and it takes a long time to figure out how to report successfully on this stuff. But just the being able to think about it, being able to look really quickly at a lot of things, and be like, this is that, this is that, this is kind of that, but this is also that other thing, was so eye-opening to me and so useful. So I try in every training I do to transmit that information to other people. If you look me up on Twitter, I posted a brief thread, and the first link in the thread is to a presentation that I've given a number of times with citations to all the different things I drew it from. So if you're interested in this issue, that's somewhere you can start and find a lot more resources. So I always try to give people that theoretical understanding first, and then move into specific reporting tips. I think that helps. The other thing that journalists do this, any expert, anyone in a position of expertise can fall prey to this really easily, myself included. You kind of want to soapbox a little bit. You want to you know stuff, the person you're talking to doesn't know stuff. And if you approach false information from the perspective that you understand this, so you're not going to ever get gotten by it, and that the other people who are vulnerable to this, I have family members who are really vulnerable to false information, that they are somehow misinformed or dumb or credulous, or that, I don't understand how anybody would ever believe that. There's stuff where I'm intuitively I don't understand why anybody would ever believe that either. But if you take a step back from that soapbox, and you just try to meet the people you're reporting about, or the issues you're reporting about, where people are at, and with the real fears that they have. And I think, again, drawing on the early days of COVID-19 experience, that terrifying unknown we were all sort of thrust into, it's really helpful here. We can all have direct empathy for this uncertainty. I think that is the other thing that I try to always make sure reporters, I'm talking to them, I'm even if you're talking to someone who believes this with their whole heart, is convinced of a specific piece of false information. I'm not going to give you examples because I don't want to spread it. But if you're talking to someone who believes it with their whole heart, and it's someone who is not specifically and aggressively attempting to profit off that, the profit component is a big deal, then, just try to like approach it with empathy. And the other thing I always tell people, and this is like, if I could get you to take one other takeaway from this, from doing this kind of reporting, information gaps are where misinformation flourishes. So where there's like a question. So for instance, early on, when the CDC was talking about, well, you don't need a mask. We don't need masks. Then all of a sudden they were like, oh no, actually we do. We all should be wearing masks all the time now in public. In that information gap, a lot of misinformation flourished because people were looking for answers. They're like, should I wear a mask? Should I not wear a mask? What sort of mask should I wear? Does a valve matter? Does a valve not matter? Does an N95 matter? And if sorry, I'm thinking back to that reporting time, and it was so urgent and so dynamic and so freaky, frankly.
Well, actually, I mean, there's one story you told me. It was a small story when you were doing your COVID reporting. You just went into the park and sort of got a sense of what was happening in the local community during the early pandemic shutdown, and that was a powerful story to me because I feel like we often lose the emotional truths in these stories. We're so focused on the fact check aspect of it. As much as we know that shouting facts at people doesn't really work, it's very hard to resist the impulse. Like, if I just tell them the facts emphatically enough, they'll understand. But I love that you were doing this much more, tangible, emotional type of reporting.
Well, I think it matters. And I was talking to people who were really marginalized and who were being further marginalized by some of the COVID restrictions. And so I thought their stories mattered, and I hope that what I did contributed to local policy change. But the other thing that I was just going to say is, I talk to a lot of experts. I also do this kind of more sit down with people where they're at story reporting. Experts of all kinds, including myself, they like to soapbox. They kind of like to talk down to sources or to their audience sometimes, and to talk down to the public. Not letting the experts you're interviewing do that. Not even if they say it to you in an interview and you don't have an opportunity to push back or there's no reason to push back, not putting that in your story. Not making people who read it feel stupid is just I think a really powerful way to reach people who are on that sort of knife's edge of, am I going to believe the misinformation or am I going to turn towards the truth?
Ben, you mentioned earlier, putting some emotion or sort of a more emphatic, happy version of yourself into some of your TikToks. I'm wondering more generally how much of what you do and how you approach that type of communication, it's kind of overtly taps into the emotional response. How much you kind of build that into while you're debunking or while you're explaining that there is an emotional aspect to it.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about why the debunking videos have done well for me, and I think part of it is that TikTok is sort of designed to let conflict flourish, and I think people really like to see someone talk down to someone else, and tear apart someone's theory. And in the beginning, I recognized that, and I thought, I don't think I want to do this, because in the videos where I was more impassioned and I was, it was a topic that I really cared about, I would get a little bit more heated maybe, and those videos did well. And then I realized, this is actually just fueling the divide. And so I, from there, decided to take everything, all these debunking videos, with as much respect as I could, and always assuming that the person who created the video was doing so out of just a lack of understanding, and that they weren't intending to spread disinformation. They just maybe read an article and misinterpreted it and thought, wow, this is so cool, I want to talk about it on TikTok. And so just assuming that there was no bad intention allowed me to kind of just be friendly and just break it down in a way that was not condescending and was accessible. And I really do think that helps a lot to make it just more welcoming for those who disagree with me and may not be looking for someone to disagree with them and for someone to walk them through why what they believe is wrong, because nobody actually wants that in the end. Nobody ever wants to be told that they're wrong and explained why they are wrong. So kind of doing it in a friendly way. And oftentimes wherever I can, I'll point and say, this is actually correct about what they said, but this is where it was kind of misrepresented.
So, Seema, you've addressed two quite different levels in viral BS, really aiming at adults and specifically medical myths, with your most recent book, to a more general approach to misinformation to a younger audience. do the sort of like the tools of empathy and emotion, do they hold true kind of regardless of what audience you're talking to?
Absolutely. And in Viral BS, I talk about the fact that I was a newspaper reporter and that the whole book came about from the collection of columns I used to do for the newspaper called Debunked, where readers would send in a question like, are chemtrails in the air from the airplanes actually poisoning us? Do vaccines cause autism? Does talcum powder cause ovarian cancer? And that's what coalesced into that book. So you would think that I am like the queen of logic, and I am now. But what I confess, my dirty secret at the beginning of that book is that I grew up a conspiracy theorist, which was really typical in like immigrant communities who were finding comfort and networking off shared stories, and where we ourselves, like for example, growing up in England to a family that came from India, the British government had destroyed our country in many ways and, you know, started partition and stolen from us, and all these things they did sounded so conspiratorial but were true. So then you land in the country and then there's all this Islamophobia and xenophobia, and people say things about governments that sound demonic, but you're like, yeah, I can get down with that because they've done really bad things. And then that kind of sentiment then translates over to me growing up, not being a conspiracy theorist anymore, maybe just a little bit for fun, and being a physician in an 8-10 minute consult with a mother who doesn't want to vaccinate her kids and doesn't trust doctors as an extension of not trusting the government, right? So I talk about that in Viral BS. And so empathy is at the heart of this. One of the things I teach to a specific group of healthcare providers, to doctors and nurses, is if you only have 8 minutes, how do you convince someone that the COVID vaccine won't give you magnetic superpowers? You only have 8 minutes and you have so much to tick off and there's so much to do. And so I teach that skill. And at the heart of that is, you may want to grab someone by the shoulders and like, oh, this is ridiculous. Why do you think it will turn you into the X-Men? But you have to have empathy, because otherwise you have no hope of building a bridge with that person and connecting with them. And also the other thing that we do, and maybe we do this, I'm a science journalist, maybe we do this too, is we do throw the facts at people. And we make assumptions about why they believe what they believe. And based on those assumptions, we give them a narrative of, but the vaccine is safe and it contains these ingredients and you can read the ingredients and it's safe, it's safe. The studies show, and I've looked at this myself, that if you talk to 6 people who don't want the COVID vaccine, they might give you 6 massively different reasons. One of them might get every single shot every year, her Tdap booster, her flu shot, vaccinate her kids. She just doesn't want the COVID shot, and it's for these reasons. Somebody on the other end of that vaccine hesitancy spectrum might be like, oh, I don't want any vaccine whatsoever. And often as science journalists, we're just talking to everyone as if they're a monolith, even though publics are so different and varied, and there's ethnic and geopolitical and historical and faith and all these reasons. And unless you have empathy for that, and unless you're doing some information gathering of the people you're writing or creating journalism for, we don't stand as much of a chance of building that empathy and actually giving them the information that they're looking for.
So I'd like to throw this open to the questions in the room in just a second, but since this is a solutions-oriented panel, I hope you'll all indulge me with a lightning round question, a solutions-oriented question. What is one thing that you wish you had known before you embarked down this path to dealing with science misinformation and miscommunication? Ben, I'll start with you. What do you wish you'd known before you went down this rabbit hole?
In the very beginning, I wish I had understood more about the responsibility that comes with doing this type of work, because when I present myself online as a neuroscientist in Stanford, people assume, okay, this is a reliable source. And in the very beginning, I actually was not sourcing my information from the literature. I was just thinking about what did I learn, And I recognized pretty soon that I was just as at risk of spreading misinformation as anyone else, because I wasn't being thoughtful and careful about the information I was presenting. And I'm sure that's very different as a journalist versus a random guy picking up a phone on TikTok. But I wish I had appreciated more of how sensitive and delicate it is, and to be more cautious about what I was talking about.
Kat, what about you?
I wish, it took me a long time to figure out that misinformation reporting is not just doing a debunk or a pre-bunk or you know, explaining the bad actors behind various pieces of misinformation. When you have knowledge about it, when you have the skill set, and when you know it's happening on the beat you're covering, doing that reporting can be as simple as just, like I did a story recently on Canada's central bank where I visited our central bank. And before I went, I read a ton of, there's a lot of central bank misinformation right now around the world because of all that is happening. People are scared. There's an information gap. It's a very technical thing. So of course, misinformation floods in. And I just read a bunch of the misinformation. I tried to educate myself as much as I could about what people were saying. And then in this story, I don't mention false information once. But there are a couple of very deliberate points in the story where I put in true information that is just, I was there, I was inside the building, this is what I saw the model that the bankers are using, running. I can tell you what it looks like a bit. And some of that stuff was just to be like a really gentle debunk. Just prepare people to know more and to make sure, the only other thing is just to make sure that I wasn't accidentally spreading things that would promulgate false narratives, that would promulgate misinformation, and that were going to be used and read by people who would fall victim to those narratives.
Yeah, I might even call some of that a soft pre-bunk. There was a great pre-bunking session yesterday that looked at exactly that problem of, you know, how do you pre-bunk without basically announcing the myth or the misinformation ahead of time. So I think that's a very smart approach. Seema, what do you think?
I wish, oh, this is like a genie. It's a really good question. I have been a journalist for 10 years, covering science and health and obviously misinformation around those things. I wish I had thought many years ago about how to engage younger audiences. Because it's been so fun to do it, and I wonder if there's hesitation amongst us journalists about doing it because we don't know how to get started or we don't know where to meet young people, but it's been so rewarding, and they are so hungry for this information. They're so hungry to learn more about journalists and journalism that I wish I'd started engaging younger audiences earlier. And I would encourage you all to think about how you might do that, what organizations are in your countries that you can work with on that. I've done a lot of work with the Pulitzer Center on this because they have an education arm to them so that your journalism, when it's supported by them, doesn't just end, you know, on the broadcast piece or the written piece, but you go into schools and you talk about the impact of that journalism, or you talk more deeply about that issue. And I wish I'd done that sooner, and I wish there was more of that in general.
Let me open it up to the room for questions. Anybody? Let's see. I think, is there a microphone? Yeah. Okay, so let's start over here with the, oh yes, thank you. And when you ask a question, can you please introduce yourself first?
Hi, my name's Tanya Pampaloni, and I do some business development work for small and mid-size media groups. I just wanted to ask a bit about corporate front groups, you know, kind of in the science space. I've been reading a lot about that, and also kind of like academic corruption in that, and it's very hard, I think, for journalists to penetrate those areas. And I just wondered if you could comment a bit about that.
There's a chapter in Viral BS called Fracademia, which is exactly about those alliances between those corporate groups, in this case, big oil and big gas, who fund research so that it appears that this research on fracking is coming from a neutral arbiter of science because it's an academic and they're at a very credible academic institution. And there are climate change activists who have labeled those academics fracademics. Because we can't assume that their reporting is accurate. Even at our institution, Stanford, there are connections between the department, the School of Earth Sciences, and big oil and gas companies. I when I was reporting on those issues of how those corporations are buying scientists, I found it really helpful to build deep sources with those climate activists who were doing that reporting. And those alliances were so helpful because they had done so much of that legwork. And I think that added element of, oh, it's not just what you expect, it's not just the greenwashing, it's not just the corporations trying to dupe us on social media, but it's them buying the scientists. Right. And this is an age-old problem, it's just now taken on newer, bigger iterations, but it goes back to big tobacco and, you know, maybe even sooner than that, was really helpful for explaining the kind of strategies used by these corporations.
Yeah, we're short on time, so let's go straight to another question. I think over here with the yellow scarf.
Hi, it's been such a joy to listen to you today.
I'm sorry, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, Sophia. I'm a senior news reporter in the UK, and I'm a TikTok content creator, so my work definitely straddles a lot of what you've talked about. And I don't know if my criticism is of the British journalism scene or of other places, maybe others can add to it, but like the two best, hearing how interdisciplinary your experiences have all been, have obviously contributed to the success and what you've been able to do, right? And like the two best things I've done for my career were to get on TikTok and build the following I have done. And the other one is, I online randomly found an opportunity, applied to it and got it, and it was to do a fellowship at Brown with the Information Futures Lab. For the first time in my life, I've been able to acquire public health vocabulary and knowledge that there's no other way really as a British journalist I'd have had access to. So how do we encourage, I've had to do all of that by myself and it's been quite lonely really. How do we encourage like newsrooms to sort of support journalists acquiring these more diverse skill sets that, you know, that they're not going to be shouted about like this piece got on the 6 o'clock news is?
Kat, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, if that's okay. I think that you can just really easily make a business case for doing this work. And as a freelancer, I made a business case for doing this because I had this specialized skill set that I could bring to outlets who didn't have it. But as a beat reporter in a newsroom, you can bring a misinformation and disinformation angle to anything, and you will get stories out of it. If you spend time, and this was the answer to the other question, if you spend time grinding, you know, you grind on it, you just keep track of what's going on, you regularly monitor things, you notice that there's a rumor spreading on your beat, and you just follow up on it in a while. You will get stories. Those stories do get a fair amount of readership. They do get a fair amount of shares, and it helps your outlet be a leading voice on an issue. And because misinformation spreads so much faster than the truth, and so much more actively than the truth because of, it doesn't need to be true. It can be terrifying, it can be catchy, it can be attractive. Because of that, doing these stories can be a way to be a voice on an issue right away. You know, the second there is a news event, you can get on it from this angle, and people can be coming to you for that coverage before they're coming to anyone else.
All right, I know we're running down the clock here, but I think we can sneak in one quick final question.
I have a question about deepfakes. Do you think that AI and the possibility of fake videotape could change something in the ecosystem of the media? Because I see that with pupils of middle school, videos and photos have a strength that it's difficult to control. Perhaps also people that are also pupils that are good in understanding a fake article, they can understand errors of logic, are very vulnerable to fake images or fake videos. I have this question.
Ben, I think this is a perfect question for you. You know, how dangerous is AI, and how can you use AI in constructive ways? Because I think I'm really interested in the constructive aspects here. I feel like there are many discussions here about misuse, but I'd like to hear about constructive use of AI.
Yeah, the question is something that I've been worried about for a really long time. Ever since I saw my first deepfake, which was horrible years ago, I thought this could get really, really ugly, especially when you're using deepfakes to generate fake content from a source that's credible. And yeah, I'm I mean, I think the work that Seema is doing, instructing, teaching people how to spot, identify, and kind of maybe debunk misinformation is critical. And seems like the general consensus from what I've seen at other panels is that people kind of know that AI is prone to making mistakes and prone to spitting out fake references and things like that. And I think that's not only within journalism, but just within the general public. So as long as people know that something they're reading is AI generated, I think they're already a little bit, just cautious. But I think that the main value of AI kind of lies in creativity, and that's how I've been using it. And just, not in, if I'm writing a scientific paper, I'm not going to ask it to write the introduction for me or the discussion and access the existing literature and pull it all together. But, simpler things like I draft a paragraph and then I copy and paste it into ChatGPT and I said, make this sound better. And it basically develops a second draft for me, and I can take out what I want or leave everything. So I've also used it for image generation, for logos, and just kind of playing around with it. But I do think, I'm not an AI expert, but when we start to assign credibility to AI sources, if they've not been carefully vetted, it can become very dangerous. And I hope that, when these decisions are made, they will be very carefully made.
All right, we're unfortunately out of time here, but I know, I personally would be happy to talk to people at some other point. I'm easy to find on Twitter or through OpenMind. The other panelists are as well. And I just really want to thank HHMI and the Pulitzer Center for making this possible. And I want to really thank this group of panelists because, the dream as a moderator is that you're going to have a great discussion, and having this group of people made it very easy, and I hope you all enjoyed it as well.